That's why they also have, because religion is so important and should be a part of everyone's life, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It does not say freedom from religion. They expect us all to be religious, to be tolerant, but to never ever give churches or anyone else that power. The Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And for this occasion, I can honestly say I'm carrying out this right just because I felt it was appropriate. This is an important right, and most people, including our current courts, get it wrong. It is not a right of self-defense. You do have that right, by the way. I mean, everyone has a right to defend themselves, just like we have rights to drink whatever liquor we want or educate our children. This is rooted in the fact of the Revolutionary War. The Continental Army was created from home-run militias, privately started militias that led to the Continental Army that defeated the British. That was a British system that, for obvious reasons, was changed shortly after the Revolutionary War. What they thought is this. The militias were comprised of people who largely were self-armed. And what they envisioned at that time is that states would have their own militias, individuals would have their own weapons, and would have the ability to stand up to the federal government at any time. It was known as the right to revolution. Thomas Jefferson was a huge proponent of it. And this was a very common ideal back then. One of the checks that they had, that the states had, is each state had its own militia. And this persisted well into the Civil War. In fact, any of you who are Civil War buffs will notice that you had units such as the 5th Alabama Cavalry, which my great-great-grandfather was a member, or the 2nd Virginia Artillery. These were state-run militia units that got called into the federal army during the time of war, or in the case of the Confederate states, the Confederate Army. That was the model they saw, and that was one of the checks they saw in the government, is that a well-armed population could, as a last resort, defend itself against its own government. And that states who had their own militias, which still exist today in our state National Guards, would have a bulwark against the standing federal armies or the standing Navy. They actually envisioned a world in which you had competing armies to make sure that no single governmental entity had a complete monopoly. And as I said, this was a very different world. If you look under congressional authority under Article 2, it grants the authority to grant letters of marque and reprisal. A letter of marque is a letter issued by a government, in this case Congress, to engage in privateering. Now this was a pretty big deal back in the day. Sir Walter Raleigh, Sir Christopher Newport were privateers. They would attack Spanish ships filled with gold because they had a letter from the Queen allowing them to do so. This made them the equivalent of the dot-com millionaires of the day. In fact, Newport News was named after Christopher Newport. It was a privateering base. This was an era in which private warships were owned under the auspice licensed by the government to basically form a private navy. This was an era where large landowners would routinely buy cannons, usually 18 or 21-pound cannons, because they believed they'd have to organize folks to defend against Indians or whatnot. Or sometimes they just thought they were rich landowners and buying cannons was the thing you should do. So the key to remember here is when people talk about the Second Amendment, is yes, there is a right of self-defense. But this was written in an era where the founders lived in a world where people owned private arms, where states had their own, they envisioned states having their own armies, and they'd just come out of a Revolutionary War where they defeated the British by using local militias to form a Continental Army. This was a model they had as a bulwark against an intrusive federal government. Fortunately, we have lived in a world, and we still live in a world where that has not been necessary for over 150 years. I hope it never comes to that, but please understand, whenever they talk about the Second Amendment, they're not just talking about your right to protect yourself. They're really talking about your right to protect yourself against the government. Some of the others are pretty easy. Article 3, no soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner. That's because it happened a lot back in the day of the Revolutionary War and it caused a lot of problems. The right of the people to be secure in their Persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall be issued but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation in particular describing the place to be searched for the persons or things to be seized. As Deputy Ashley can tell you, this can be a real pain in the neck at 2 in the morning when you need to get a warrant. But I'm sure Deputy Ashley will also tell you there's a very good reason for it. It's what keeps the police department in line. 99% of your police department, of your deputies, of your sheriffs, your policemen are good people. But this today is what protects us against that 1%, the one guy who gets out of line that would have used that power. Back then, slightly different. Back then, because of all the different stamp acts and tolerance acts, a lot of smuggling became commonplace, especially among our founders who tended to like to make an extra dime without paying taxes, go figure. And so the British government at that time was allowing people to search anyone, and they would actually allow their own inspectors, their own military units there to write what's called a writ of assistance. They could write their own search warrant. It would be if Detective Ashley pulled you over and said, "You want to search your car? I'll write my own little search warrant there. There we go, let's search." And of course, what happened predictably is it gave a license to corruption. You ended up having it gave rise to corruption. People would pay it off or something. And houses were searched, wagons were searched, people were searched, and so this came in as the ultimate protection. You have a right of privacy, or as Justice Brandeis better put it, the right to be left alone. And this has always been good. Fortunately, this amendment has always more or less been upheld. Amendment 5, Amendment 6, and Amendment 7, and Amendment 8. These are all the amendments that concern due process. Things like a right to a speedy trial, things such as a right against self-incrimination, the right to not excessive bail, and the rights to not have excessive fines or cruel and unusual punishment. And this is simply because they understood that governments have power, and that a tyrannical government can simply find the expedient of throwing you in the dungeon to make you disappear. That's what all those come in. That everyone should have certain processes and procedures to make sure that if you are seized by the government, that you are judged properly. That's where the right to trial comes from. Not because we believe that jury trials are inherently better. And I can tell you as an attorney, a lot of times I ask for a judge trial because I think it's going to go better than a jury trial. But the real reason is because a jury trial is independent. That at the end of the day, a government does not control a jury. And that's the key to those 4 amendments. That's why there's 4 of them. These are the 4 things that prevent me from picking my favorite guy in the green shirt and having Deputy Ashley, who may very well be Sheriff Ashley here in a few weeks, and having him thrown in jail and disappeared and making the paperwork go away and ending my problem because he protested my governance. This is the key that happens in every tyranny. Hitler, Stalin, South America, every Islamic dictatorship, every Chinese government, every Asian dictatorship. This is the hallmark. This is the bad point. This is the nightmare scenario. People are picked up off the streets, thrown in jail, thrown into the gulag, show trials are held, if at all. People are executed, people die. Those 4 amendments are where they're. The last 2 are the ones that have been ignored and the ones that I've spoken of before. The 9th Amendment says the enumeration of the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. This is that infamous, to some people, idea that says just because it's not the Constitution doesn't mean you get to do it. It says the reverse. If it's not in the Constitution, the government doesn't get to do it. Just because it's not in this Bill of Rights doesn't mean you get to restrict it. This is the most ignored amendment ever. This is the one that's been ignored when they talk about how big our toilet bowls are, when they talk about how much mileage our cars should get. This is what they talk about when they tell a hospital whether they can or cannot buy a magnetic resonant imager. This is the one they get when they buy GM. This is the one they get when they try and tell executives under the Department administration how much money they should get. This is the one that people forget when the government does pretty much 99% of what it does now. And of course, the 10th is the one that says the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. And that means if you, the government, don't get to do it, it goes to the states or the people. And as I said before, if the 17th Amendment had not been in place, I can guarantee you most of the legislation that has been passed since 1920 would not be in existence today if the states had any say over it. I do not believe most of the New Deal legislation would have been passed. Social Security would not have been passed. Medicaid and Medicare, which have placed huge burdens on the state budgets, would not have been passed. The laws that required drinking ages to be lowered from 21 to 18, otherwise you don't get federal funding, would not have been passed. And please note, some of these things were done with the best of intentions. No one's against drunk driving. I mean, no one's in favor of drunk driving. No one is against helping out people who need medical care or poor. No one's against helping people in their old age have a pension. The point is, when you ignore this, you end up with a gloomy deficit and all sorts of unintended consequences. So to end, what are a few things you can do? And here's a few suggestions, and I like to be a little specific. These are the things that you should think of and try and root for and promote as you go forward. Things you can ask candidates to do in the future. These are the annoying questions you should ask people when they're on their forms. Candidates in the back, sorry about that. But these are some of the things that I would suggest, that if I were in charge, you could actually do it in 10 minutes flat, that I would recommend it. And I would do one thing, primarily. Think like the founders. Don't think in terms of ideology. Don't think in terms of specific problems. I mean, Social Security's deficit is bad, the deficit is bad, the debt is bad. Think in terms of structure. Think in terms of this nice, concise little document that was designed to prevent all of that. I would say, repeal the 17th Amendment. We've shown that senators who are appointed by states can be crooks. We've also shown since then that senators elected by the people can be crooks. We're going to have crooks as senators. At least when they go back to being appointed by states, they might actually follow the 10th Amendment, which is what the founders intended. I would ask and encourage all of you that whenever you endorse any candidate at any time that is in a legislative position, to ask them to repeal and dismantle. Whenever you hear a Republican say we can fix Obamacare, that should be a warning sign that he is not fit for office, in my opinion. Ask them to repeal things, to dismantle things. Will they get rid of the Department of Education? Will they repeal Obamacare? Will they get rid of the FDA? Will they get rid of things that had good intentions but have caused more problems? Don't ask them what they're going to do. Ask them what they will repeal. What will they get rid of? What powers will they give up and forego when they're in office? That would be a good first step. I would look to change the legislation that limited congressmen to 435 congressmen. At the time that law came into place, the average congressman represented about 25,000 individuals. That's about the same amount of people that a Walton County commissioner represents these days. Right now, Congressman Jeff Miller represents about 415,000 people, give or take. There is no way Jeff Miller can get out and see all those people. And Jeff Miller's a good man. I'm not trying to slam him. I just know this because I happen to run in that district as a judge.